Hello. Welcome to the third and final installment of lectures by the Architectural League Prize winners. There are 6 winners of the prize. Tonight we'll be hearing from 2 of them, Garrett Ricciardi and Julian Rose of Formlessfinder, and Isaac Michan Daniel of Michan Architects. My name is Mira Henry, and as one of the recent League Prize winners, I had the privilege of being on the selection committee along with Kevin Hirth and Kutana Yada. As a committee, we were asked to develop a theme for this year's applicants. The theme was to both reflect our current moment, let's say pulses that we felt are in the air, and at the same time challenge the field with what would signal a necessary and critical stance. We felt strongly that in following the 2019 theme of just, this year needed to continue to open up and unfold a contemporary conversation around the cultural consequences of architectural thinking, particularly within the emerging generation of designers. We chose the term value. And while this term is broad and somewhat slippery, value is an evident declaration of one's position towards the world. As we wrote, at a contemporary moment of political and social precariousness in which all cultural value sets seem publicly permissible, this year's Architectural League Prize competition asked the entrant, what are ways in which notions of value operate in your work? How are your values mediated by the process of design? What are the discursive contexts, forms of representation, or spaces of action in which these values become manifest? I would add very simply that what are your values? What do you stand for? And I would insist that these are in fact architectural questions. We will begin with a lecture from Formlessfinder, followed by a lecture from Michan Architects. As a form of introduction, I would like to share some reflections on the work and position of each office. Formlessfinder operates between LA and New York and has projects both near to and far flung from their multiple centers. Their working methodology actively inverts and subverts existing market-driven value chains within the context of global capitalism. Their powerful and memorable body of work to date explores a critical aesthetic and conceptual agenda of excess, waste, and rawness, with a specific attention to the mechanics and sensuality of piling, stacking, binding, and the excavation of material. Equally as specific yet quite different in nature, Michan Architects situates value in processes, procedures, and craft of construction within the context of a local building industry. Based in Mexico City, Michan Architects have an extensive and highly articulated portfolio of urban-centered building projects, many of which have been completed. Their work embraces the intersection between formal desire and an economic realism of construction. In this way, they deftly bring together notions of the material unit, building type, context, contingency, and history. I very much look forward to hearing more about their work in these lectures and celebrating their thinking. Their lecture will be followed by a live Q&A, so please stick around. Those on Zoom are invited to participate by posting questions in the chat. Before we begin, I'd like to share 2 acknowledgements. The first is that this year, the winners have committed to donating a portion of their honoraria to NOMA's Project Pipeline, and encourage all of you to support this important educational and mentorship program, NOMA, the National Organization of Minority Architects. You can find a link here tonight as well as on the landing page for this program on the League's website. Secondly, regarding AIA continued education units for New York State, registered viewers who join Zoom airing of the program at 7 p.m. Eastern Time and remain for the entirety are eligible to receive credit. After the program, please email rsvp@arcleague.org with your full name and AIA number so that the League can report your credits. With that, I would like to welcome the 2020 League Prize winners, Formlessfinder and Michan Architects.
Hello, I'm Garrett Ricciardi, half of Formlessfinder, joining from Los Angeles. Hi, I'm Julian Rose, joining you from New York City, where the other half of Formlessfinder is permanently based and currently quarantined. We're both delighted to be here.
So we just want to start by thanking the Architectural League of New York and also the audience for tuning in from all over. We're also extremely happy and honored after many years of applying for this prize. And I believe this is actually our last year of eligibility. So it's a great honor, and also to be in such great company with the other recipients. And for a number of reasons, this year we are particularly proud to be considered a good fit for the League's theme of value. The fundamental idea of value has been core to our work from the very beginning. For us, by rethinking architecture's primary relationship to form and taking on ideas of materials, structure, and waste in new ways has been the foundation of our practice. If there is perhaps one question that started Formlessfinder, it was in asking, has too much value been placed on the very idea of form within architecture?
And from the beginning, we found that informal work needs to come from an informal way of working. So this is a diagram we use to explain the structure of Formlessfinder and to show that we are always working on a wide range of projects simultaneously. And even if this doesn't resemble the structure of a traditional architectural office, we do feel that it all feeds back into our practice. And these different strands range from teaching to writing books to organizing symposia with experts whose work we feel is relevant to our own, whether that's a physicist or an environmental scientist. But above all, we feel that the core of our practice is research, and that our best work grows out of long-term, sometimes even multi-year research projects. And that's certainly true of the projects we've selected to show you this evening.
So we want to share maybe 3.5 projects. And what we want to begin the lecture with is the first project where we really have an opportunity to bring these ideas of value and materiality to life. So it's our kind of first built project. The project brief was rather simple. Medium scale public pavilion designed as a sort of entryway for the Design Miami Fair, and servicing roughly 75,000 guests in a week. And then the other component really just simply that it had to be erected within a week prior, and then taken down within a week, the week after. And so drawing from research threads and our previous work, we sought to propose a new type of prototype driven by local architectural typologies. One obviously structural, the prototype that you see on the right, which is a pop-up, or I should rather say a pop-in aluminum frame hurricane roof that literally goes within your stick frame building to stop your home's roof from blowing away. These were very prevalent in retrofits after Hurricane Katrina. And the other one, natural and ecological, but maybe not so obviously structural, which is the sand pile. And on the one hand, we think of sand in Miami as ubiquitous and as outsiders, a kind of symbol of play and leisure and recreation. But on the other hand, locally, sand is seen more as a nuisance and more of a culprit in construction. And we were looking for a way to can you rethink sand outside of these norms? Another thing we were really sort of fascinated by these two, call them prototypes, the pile and the pop-up roof, were their similarity, geometrical similarity. Structurally very different, one light, one heavy, one stable, one amorphous, but both with the same section, both with the same elevation. And maybe perhaps kind of naive to think that you could put them together. And in doing so, and I think this is relevant to our work throughout, is that the kind of apparent naivete in, say, playing within the sandbox of structural and architectural tools is kind of naive on the engineering side, and it's actually quite the opposite. So here's a structural diagram on the left developed with Robert Silman Associates, and a kind of point by point loading analysis of the complexity of building with seemingly kind of simple materials. And in the end, we got something like this, right? The sort of last piece of the puzzle here is a question of, and it is a question of value, a question of where these materials come from. And let's say, I would say we're deeply invested in the narrative and the sourcing of materials, and maybe uncovering stories and narratives that may not be totally obvious, right? You think of the kind of phrase, "Don't bring sand to the beach," and that is exactly what Miami Beach is. There, at this point, is really no local sand on Miami Beach. So the left diagram, if you see the sort of light pink area, is where all the aggregate in the state comes from that helps to replenish those beaches.
So one theme that we've certainly talked about a lot in relation to tent pile, but also in relation to most of our projects, is what we think of as alternative use value. And that's basically a question of what new value is added when we use an unconventional material like sand, or an unconventional construction process like the pile. So in this project, it was really the lack of foundation that was the crucial dimension. The client made it very clear that there couldn't be any kind of foundation in the project because it was a temporary structure in a parking lot. There could be no excavation, no anchoring into the ground of any kind. And typically in years past, when the fair had commissioned a pavilion, that meant it looked like a light temporary structure. And what we did was use the weight of the sand to stabilize the structure in a way that served as a foundation without having any of the negative challenges of actually digging into the ground. So that was the main way we saw ourselves as sort of adding value. We got the kind of added scale and added ambition of quote unquote real heavy architecture without any of the drawbacks of a truly permanent structure. Another value added effect we thought of was actually kind of environmental dimension of the project. And when we started building mock-ups, we very quickly realized that the interior of the pile stayed much cooler than ambient temperature, which is similar to when you're at the beach on a hot day. You can barely walk on the sand with bare feet, but as soon as you dig down below the surface, it's quite cool. And so we designed a system of metal fins that were embedded deep into the pile and also protruded through the retaining wall, and they actually produced a radiant cooling effect under the tent. So here's a detail of the wall where you can see that happening. The other question in the project for us was sort of how far we could take the formless. And something we found in all of our work is you could say that you can't make everything formless all of the time. So we thought of this project in a way as having a kind of clean side and a dirty side. So that was in fact why we decided to cut the pile in half with the retaining wall structure. So here you can see an image of the clean side. We designed some simple furniture using raw aluminum, the same raw material as the truss itself. And we thought of this as the place where visitors to the fair could kind of do business as usual. They could talk on their cell phones, take a cigarette break, even have a business meeting. And then the other side was the dirty side, and this is where we went from kind of alternative use value to just alternative use, full stop. And what we were really excited about this was that it became a kind of play space, not just for kids, but as you can see here, for grown-ups too. And it's that playful side of the formless, the way that informal structures can open up new informal ways of engaging with structures or using them or interacting with them, that we really feel like was one of the most important lessons we learned in the project, and that we've tried to carry forward into the rest of our work today.
So the next project we want to share is our first urban project and our urban installation. I think because of the nature of the materials and the processes, we work with, many of the things we get to look at are kind of out within the landscape. But like all good architects, we are urbanists, and so this was a kind of first challenge to bring this idea back, some of these ideas back into the city. And so what you're seeing here is Harvey Corbet's 1908 School of Applied Design for Women in New York City on the East Side. A really kind of stunning old masonry structure, and you know, a common thread also throughout the work is like, how is value found in strange ways, like the use value that Julian is talking about, and very often this is found through excess, right, or mass and excess. So what we wanted to do was produce a type of contextual formlessness, let's say contextual formless within the city. And the project was a retail collaboration between Art for a Magazine and Comme des Garçons, who runs and operates the building as a kind of high-end retail experiment. And dotted throughout this 6-story structure are a number of really one-of-a-kind, one-off retail experiments. And in approaching us, you know, Art Forum had a kind of modest budget and you know, large ambitions, and in that we really sought to see, you know, what can we do and kind of satisfy all sides of this. And maybe typical to Formlessfinder is a kind of, maybe, let's say, dumpster dive approach to foraging or resourcing our own materials. Like, very often we'll find ourselves in the storage closets or the warehouses of our clients, maybe more so than at their conference tables. So so this structure is one that is produced from waste, and it is produced from excess. And what we found was that the magazine had an abundance of back issues that we sort of fashioned into a very heavyweight masonry system, a system that could survive through kind of pure compression. And, you know, so like, in this waste as a display, we're really looking for ways to extend the architectural vocabulary of, let's say, reusability beyond the simple terms of recycling. By leaving these unfixed, true to a masonry building, let's say where mortar isn't doing as much work maybe as the mass is, we're designing a magazine brick held together, you know, literally by its own dead weight, and not so much screws or welds. And then just showing a couple images of the details, the clamping on the left, and then an interior shot on the right. Oh, sorry, an interior shot on the next page.
So the next project we want to show quickly is the HAF project that Garrett mentioned earlier. And it grew, as you'll see, really directly out of the Art Forum project, but it was also about extending our interest in waste to a different scale. And it actually came out of an ongoing kind of obsession we've had with the waste that's produced from infrastructure, and especially highways, bridges, and roads, because as you can imagine, when something like a new highway is constructed and an old one is destroyed, there's a tremendous amount of construction material that's essentially discarded. So the project, which we somewhat mischievously called Stool Sample, was done in response to a commission from the Storefront for Art and Architecture, which invited us to design a small seat for an exhibition in their space. And basically our idea was to take a core sample drilled from a section of roadway that was going to be demolished, and using a very simple compression system, again, based directly on the Art Forum project, turn that itself into the seat. We show that primarily as a kind of bridge to the final project we want to show. And we want to end on a work in progress, because we feel that this project shows the kind of scale we're trying to explore, or the sort of attempt we're currently making to bring the ideas we've been working on into a new scale of architecture. So this is another project that deals with highways, infrastructure, and landscape, but it's also very directly a project about competing value systems. And specifically, it's about the conflict between infrastructure development and archaeological excavation. And this project it began as a commission from the curators of the Kuwait Pavilion at the upcoming Venice Biennale, which, as I'm sure all of you know, has been delayed, just as the League's programming has been delayed due to the pandemic. But the curators have envisioned the pavilion as a series of studies of land use in Kuwait. And this is a map the curators provided showing different hotspots of conflicting land use within the country. So we were approached specifically because of our ongoing interest in and research into infrastructure and architecture. And our site is pictured here. It's in the desert on the north shore of Kuwait Bay. And this is a point where construction of a new major highway has run directly into an ancient city. And not so much is known about the archaeological site yet, but it's at least 4,000 years old, and initial research suggests of sort of priceless historical value. So our fundamental contention in this project is that, depending on how you look at them, the processes of infrastructure construction and archaeological research aren't maybe so different. And what this slide gets to is the fact that they're both very literally beginning from a hole in the ground. And so on the left side, you see a series of sections drawn by archaeologists through excavations on archaeological sites. And on the right side, you see a series of sections through highways done by infrastructure engineers. And our point is that unless you look really closely, you can barely tell the difference.
So what you can see in this image is a way to synthesize a building that is equal parts infrastructure and equal parts architecture, equal parts exhibition and equal parts active excavation. And through this approach, what we like is that large-scale construction could propose a kind of radical value proposition of building. I guess that's just to say, to build a building, a cultural building, at the cost of a highway. It's kind of a compelling argument for us, both in an individual building and the possibility to produce multiples of that building. But what might not be so apparent on the site is that there's actually a lack of sand to produce things like concrete for large-scale highways or bridge overpasses. What looks like an abundance of free and available sand, it actually lacks the specific granular geometry for mixing concrete. So the vast natural resource really has no way to find its place within architectural materials. So what we are sort of proposing is that instead of working with addition, is that we could produce an architecture of subtraction, of cutting or piling loose grains that can stand in as structural materials. And with this aim, what we're kind of after in this is a building that maybe uses less imported sand than even a conventional highway overpass. Sorry. And of the many things that have kind of intrigued us about working at this scale, and it's not just the scale of the building, which we're certainly excited to expand literally the scale of what we've been thinking about, but it's also the scale of the narrative, the layers of the narrative and the history, and the landscape, and the disciplines, archaeology, architecture, art, etc. Things that we've drawn, disciplines and sources we've drawn on over the years for our practice. And in this sort of layering, what we've sort of come to the conclusion at is perhaps being able to make a building or an architecture that let's say the meaning and the ideas could not be put into a drawing, right? And for that reason, we've sort of switched to this idea of starting to make films as a sort of stand-in for drawing. The film that I'm just going to show you just some snippets of here is shown as an episode 0 in its entirety, 8 minutes, through the Architectural League website for our contribution to the exhibition.
So one of the things that's been really productive for us about this Venice project is it's allowed us to think about the new scales and new opportunities we want to seek out in our practice moving forward. And we've actually found that there's been a really productive symmetry between that and the Architectural League Prize, which has, of course, provided an invaluable opportunity to look back over all the work we've made in the years since we founded our practice. And we have realized that thinking about value in these contexts, as we've dealt with it in the past and how we want to carry it forward, we have come to one major realization about shared value in architecture, and that's what we want to end our lecture on today. And we felt like when we read the League's call for entries that they were putting the theme of value out as almost a provocation. Asking what value is in architecture today is a kind of provocative, even paradoxical question, because it seems obvious that there is no shared value in architecture. And we would argue you can see this formally above all. There's no one style of contemporary architecture, and there's no real agreement about what contemporary architecture should look like. But as we looked back at our projects and tried to think about the common threads between them, we realized that there is one universal value system that does dominate contemporary architecture, and it's something we all deal with every day, whether we think about it or not, and that's economic value. And we would say that most of our projects have been an effort to work around market forces to kind of short circuit economic value, most obviously by building with waste, which is something that by definition has no economic value. Because when you build with something like waste, you suddenly can operate on a new set of terms. And we feel that that's really the best way we can think of to open up the possibility of reintroducing new values into architecture. Thanks. Good night. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. I'm really happy to be here and sharing my work with you. It's really an honor for me and for the office to receive this mention. First of all, I want to thank the Architectural League for the recognition, especially Anne and Katharina for putting a lot of effort into still making this happen given the current context. Also want to thank my family, friends, colleagues and the people that has been working in the office throughout the years and the different projects that we've produced, and Alexandra for her constant support in all of the work. This submission are very stimulating to us because it's not only a portfolio proposal, but a way to reframe the work, the year's theme. While working, it is more difficult to track down what's going on. It is always with some distance from the project that we can observe from another perspective what are our obsessions that are driving the work. And in this case, what is the concept of value that is in our work. I want to give a personal conclusion of these two images. This is the work of Mexican architect Juan O'Gorman. And the first image is his first built project. It's a pure modernist project, as we see, as you can see. And the second image is his last project. It's his own house, the second image. What's interesting and fascinating to me is that he started as a pure modernist, and this transition into this more material and more rich in terms of the expression of the space. And for me, my reading is that what happened to him in this process is that he became very aware of the culture where he lives, Mexico, and he encouraged that kind of materiality and that kind of accident, if you want to call it, like this cave atmosphere. And this is something that I've been very interested in the last years. And I think it's kind of happening in my work, in the way that you work in the site and with the materials and with the constraints of the context informs the project back and actually gives some value back to the project. So because of the context that we're working on, we try to work from within and understand how the internal construction logic operates, and then at very precise moments tweak them and break them, almost kind of like an alchemist, in the sense that they let their exploration on matter move and change the way they conceptualize back the work. So it's not only that you have this intellectual idea of this conceptual idea of the project and you just apply it to matter or to the site. You let the site and matter and things that are around you inform this process, and it's a constant feedback. So here we can see some kind of catalog of materials that we're working on, and we always try to push this material quality expression back into the conceptual and also into the material. This is kind of our family of projects. We don't see one project as a single entity. We rather see them as a whole. So again, one project influences the other, and it can be a design for a lamp, for a ceiling, or the scale of a building, or the scale of a wall. It really doesn't matter the scale. We try to be at the beginning unrelated to scale and program, and then when we work back in program and scale and material, it hits these conceptual forms and it starts to evolve and mature into the project. So in this sense, I find that the context of Mexico, where all of our work is taking place, it's the best way where we can be practicing now, because we really test ideas and are hands-on in the process. And we sometimes have to go to other disciplines, such as being a contractor or working very closely with each specificity of contractors, such as steel workers or brick workers, to understand them and to try to push this back into the work and to gain back more agency. This is more or less where the the formal meets the material, and it's also, as I said, a constant loop and feedback. I'm gonna start explaining some projects. This one is Z53. It's a low-cost housing project in Mexico City in collaboration with Grupo Nodus. This is the facade of the project. And this is the context. It's in a context of mid-density. Most of it is single houses. Some 4 to 5 story buildings are starting to appear. It's an hybrid of self-construction versus some planned developments and projects. Most of it is brickwork, masonry brick walls, either left exposed or covered with stucco. So since the beginning, we became aware of this limitation that we had. And rather than seeing it as a limitation, we tried to embrace it and push it its full potential. So we started to look at these bricks to see how we could find an expression that it's part of the structure, the ornament, the skin, and it doesn't cost more. We were very limited by the budget of this project. So we started testing materials with some mock-up, just overlaying the bricks to see what we could produce. We also saw this standardized brick as an opportunity to cover the hollows at the bottom and put some planters, but it was, we would have a lot of water leaking problems, so we decided not to. And then the construction process, as I said, it's always very reaching, and we try to involve there a lot. We have to find this way to place the concrete frames hidden, so the bricks had this were this formwork, just where they're left. And then the plan is basically these 2 courtyards that are divided into 4 courtyards with the vertical circulations. And then the units have views either towards the streets or towards these internal patios. In the ground, we have some floor below for parking and some parking on the ground, some share amenities in the ground. And the units are around 60 square meters with two bedrooms and open space for living, dining, kitchen. This is the section where we can see the patios, the courtyards, and the underground parking. Then we were producing these details. We are very aware that we like to kind of get into a lot of details of the constructions, like push them and find ways to resolve them and to invent how we can build them. This is the image where we can see how the lights hits the facade project, and it's like always changing when the lights hit because of these different protrusions of the bricks. This is the interior where you see outside, but in the ground, but when you're outside, you don't see inside. And then these moments of the courtyards where we have this closing beam to connect the structure, but also frames the courtyard. And different moments of the staircase where we have this kind of zigzag railing, and this is the outside of the core, the vertical core. Also, again, when you get closer, you start to see different qualities of the facade until you reach this point where you see this abstract landscape and you don't really see what it is. It can be kind of decontextualized if you just see the image. And again, these texture moments that are structure, ornament, skin. This is a recent image that I took when we went to make this short film. And I love the quality of the bricks, that they're aging and how they are actually becoming over. The second project is a landscape design for a house renovation. in the outskirts of Mexico City. So basically here we see the house as it was, and then we restore the house, minimum, change some interiors, and the main focus of the project was in the exterior and how the exterior meets the existing house. So we were playing with this notion of an autonomous new entity that when it meets the existing house, it adapted perfectly. So there's this ambiguous thing that the new thing is completely new, but at the same time attaches perfectly to the existing. Here we see the plans, and it was this thing where it enters, it's this pedestrian walkway towards the entry of the house, and it's also this vehicular entry. They managed the topography heights of the house, and it culminated into a canopy that I'll show you. So this was the canopy. It was this steel structure that it was then covered with bended wooden panels. This is the view from above. We played with the symmetry of the house into the new design. We hired the structural engineer. We produced all the drawings for construction, and at the end, we were about to start. The client didn't want to build this, so we only focus on the entry part, on these folded plates, and how these folded plates became different types of program and different elements for the landscape. So we produce a lot of drawings into figuring out how we could build this, because we didn't have budget for a roller machine to bend the steel plates. So we produced these drawings, and at the end of the day, none of this worked. We just printed the unfolded plates one to one, and the steel workers cut it there and then bend it manually. This is one of the planters that it was bent manually. This was amazing and exciting for me, because I discovered that we could invent and we could take advantage of the site. And if we knew how to tweak materials, we could invent processes into construction. This moment I also find interesting is when the plate kind of dissolves into these three fingers, and then these three fingers touch the railing of the staircase. Also, these moments where the plates are almost meeting before they were welded. And we tested an idea of a roof surface that was attached to the existing wall, and then was just an entry canopy. And then after this happened, after we saw these images, we became aware of this notion of playing with a very controlled quality of geometry and precision versus this uncontrolled quality of the vegetation that we loved, and we started to encourage this notion of control on control, of finding an accident and then playing with this accident. This was actually accidental. It just happened after we put vegetation, but then we started encouraging into the rest of our projects. These are some images of how the planter becomes a small wall, and then the wall becomes this step. We were always close in the site. And then from that project that was in 2015, this project in 2018-20, it's kind of a continuation of that in a different program and type of project. This is a restaurant, an interior design for a restaurant. And what we did for this restaurant is basically just designing the back of the restaurant. So in this image that I'm showing, this is just the back, the poche of the restaurant. It's basically the bar, the sushi bar, it's a Japanese restaurant, so the sushi bar, the bathroom, and the kitchen. Then the rest of the restaurant is just left exposed. The notion that's connected to the previous one is that it's this plane that it's bended and peeled to produce program inside. but this one is with a wooden element. So here we see how the ceiling is exposed. The outside, we designed few, we left it as it is, just painted. And we're very careful planning these bended walls and these soffits that they meet tangentially, they peel, and then they produce these different elements. Then the interior of the bathroom I'll show later. It's also a test on materials that we produce. And these moments where the wall becomes the soffit, and the soffit contains the part of the sushi bar. And then this part that I told you, in the bathroom, we tested this idea of a terrazzo that we produce inside. It's not a casted terrazzo, it's just leftover stones. And then the conceptual idea of this is that when it hit the vertical plane as is digitally, it would be mapped wrong, and it would leach this vertical extrusion of whatever is touching the material. So this is the conceptual idea, and then this is the process that I'm excited in getting into this process and translating this digital part into this physical. Of course, you lose quality. It doesn't finish as I showed the render, but it gains also some other quality. So this is the final image of how it touches the vertical wall and then just extrudes this vertical line. We go all the way to designing the handle of the door into the same conceptual idea of bending this steel plate. Then this is another project, Luma Cafe. In this one, also we designed with very raw materials. We designed a ceiling element. It's basically a layout, very straightforward. It's only had one door that it had a view towards the street. So the kitchen is at the back, the services, you can see them. It's very straightforward plan. And then we had a lot of height, so we produced this lamp that it's hanging, and then it has these cables, and these cables produce this lighting device. Here we can see them. The interesting part also happened in the translation process. First we just unfolded, then bended, and then tested with this textile. These are the material experiments in 1-to-1 scale. And this is all the CNC coated felt. Then at site, we stitch it before, and then minimum at site. And then tested as, again, material in different scale for the stone. And for the concrete cast that we did some cast inside concrete, we played with textures, with notion of polish versus raw. Also this idea of the extruded bench where the cuts are then bush hammered. And this notion of the wall that we will see happened also accidental. This is a stucco wall, but we just mapped it with this texture. We didn't know what it was. We liked it, and then we translated into this thing of random lines. First it was this pattern, then another pattern, then we designed, we didn't want any pattern, so we just produced, we just told the workers to produce this very random feeling, and it actually, I think, worked much better than if we really would have designed every specific moment of line. So in that sense, we haven't figured out how, but we like to connect this notion of John Cage open reading into the work. We're still figuring out this. These are the final image where we see the terrazzo, the concrete, the stucco kind of lines, and the lamp elements, the lamp hanging. So this notion of two elements that don't relate to each other, but in the geometry they relate. So one gives feedback to the other in a way, one deforms the other. And again, this notion of the extruded bench, and this moment of like highlighting this tunnel for the and again, after doing this project, we became aware of this interest that we have in the messy or uncontrolled geometry or uncontrolled final result, but it's actually very controlled and very planned. And I want to end with this image of Giacometti that I find the relation of this notion that seems something very chaotic, random lines everywhere, but they are actually very orderly and create a non-controlled coherence. And this is all. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward for the discussion. Thank you.
Hello. Almost. Hi, you guys.
Hi.
Hey.
Congratulations. Hi. Do you guys know each other?
Yeah, well, we do now. I know Julian, of course. Yeah, I'm sure everyone wants to speak to this, but I'd say communication amongst the teams with the exhibition being online instead of in person this year has brought us all together in a probably different way than normal. So we've met and spoken quite a bit throughout. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean not physical, but yeah, in Zoom and.
And Isaac, you're in Mexico City right now?
Yeah.
Great. The lectures were beautiful. The work is beautiful. Thoughtful, arresting. The vocabularies are so many. So I want to kind of get into it, and I'm going to try and. I'm going to do the thing where I'm going to try and have a little bit of a conversation. I could kind of do what we could pitch a series of questions each of you guys individually, but I decided, I don't know, it's kind of nice. There's a lot of synergies in a way, even though I think coming from very different conceptual directions. So I'm going to try and pitch a series of questions that could have some resonance, could be a sort of the kind of overlap in a Venn diagram, so to speak. The first question is on this idea, which I found really, I think that I am also quite interested in, but I'm really found powerful in both of your work, which is this idea of working within a system, working within existing systems. And Garrett and Julian sort of working within systems of economic systems of say, value systems for materials, and Isaac, this idea of working sort of in kind of economy of building, very specific economy of building, the sort of existing systems of construction, let's say, and I wonder whether or not these are coming from really different maybe traditions. Maybe Formlessfinder, it seems like it's maybe related a bit more to a tradition of conceptual tradition of institutional critique, potentially, I wonder. Isaac, I wonder whether or not this tradition is maybe more related to sort of a practice of kind of improvisation that happens in the tradition of craft. But nonetheless, the system itself becomes a space for invention and critique. And I'm wondering if, first of all, if you guys would characterize your work or working methods in that way. And also, is that a choice? Is it something that you learned and was part of your education? Was it a sort of deliberate departure? Is it a strategy? Is it a sort of strategy for survival? What's at play in sort of working kind of within specifically within a system?
There's a ton there. Maybe I'll just jump in quickly, and then obviously I'm sure we all have a lot to speak to, but I would say for Garrett and myself, it was actually kind of a turn against our education. I mean, I think we felt, at least in the States, at least at the time we were in school, that there was not only an emphasis on form, but kind of even underlying that, there was a sense that an almost modernist sort of fetishization of a Taza, like this sort of ground up project was like the coolest thing an architect could do. And, you know, you like, maybe, I don't know, maybe there was even a sort of fatigue, like a hangover of conceptualism and postmodernism, et cetera. But I think part of our idea of really trying to work within given systems and to expand the notion of context from the literal site to the, you know, the construction methods, et cetera, with, which obviously Isaac's work is really brilliantly engaged with as well. I think that was actually part of a little bit of a sense that architects shouldn't be trying to kind of start from scratch on any given project, you know, that it was, and, you know, it certainly is strategic in the sense of survival too. I mean, often, as we've said, that's a way to build on a shoestring budget, or that's a way to bring some invention into a project that otherwise wouldn't have room for it. But I do think it's part of a kind of underlying ethos.
I mean, for us in the practice, it's been, I think, more of an afterthought. We started and we realized that the construction in the context where we're in, it's part of an extension of the process, and that we can actually challenge sometimes the status quo of traditions of constructions. So we have encouraged that into the design, and not just finish the project and hand it to the contractor and then the contractor do whatever. So we're very close, and then we find that this can be an interesting loop. And I think in a way with Formlessfinder, that what we could share is maybe this notion of exploring the material or the process, and find sometimes unexpected results. Like for me, sometimes sometimes you have more space to explore that, and sometimes you're very constrained by all the contingencies. But I think somewhere between that.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on a couple of these points. Something we've talked about quite a bit throughout is, let's say, systems outside of architecture, and I think that's certainly a direct point of critique for us, and I think that has to do with cultural systems. You know, what is kind of acceptable materials in architecture, acceptable structural stability, so I think quite a bit of our systems that turn into buildings or installations actually come from outside of architecture. We didn't show the kind of full trajectory of the art form project, but there was a small little stage set we did for an exhibition at the Museum of Art and Design in New York before that, where that structural system came out of. And it's literally an airdrop system for air packages dropped out of an airplane turned upside down. So like the crate goes on the bottom, you throw everything on top and you strap it to it and you push it out the back of a plane. And that became a system that we brought into architecture for small pavilions or furniture pieces. So I think we're always looking to, let's say, maybe critique if it's critical, it's just saying there are many, many informal systems outside of known structural systems that can expand our idea of value, cheapness, ease of construction, that we want to kind of drag into into our practice.
And then messiness, right? There's like this conversation about messiness that seems like there's a vocabulary that I wonder whether or not we could kind of flesh out a little bit here. One has to do with certain, I mean, of course, Formlessfinder, the idea of formlessness has a sort of kind of history and set of references, almost moving towards the abject. But nonetheless, for everybody here, this idea of the form of the messy or the kind of wild or the I wrote some terms down, rawness, as compared to say the calculated, right?
Yeah.
Isaac, I mean, it was really beautiful, the sort of the two references that you showed. The last painting, the Giacometti painting, with the sort of like, it felt like somebody like slapped the canvas, but then like there's also like a grid. And then the Juan O'Gorman, which is a stunning, right, like comparison, the sort of diptych of those two, like early, beginning and end of career, or early kind of late career. And I wonder where you guys all are in terms of this, I don't know, this sort of like flirtation or like commitment to, or double downing, or I don't know, the kind of calibration of that which is wild, or that which is kind of formless and difficult. I mean, I was really struck, Garrett and Julian, with the cut into that sort of the tent pile project, and the sort of clean side and the messy side, and like wanting to know what your conversation is between you about, like, do you want it to be more messy, or do you want it to be more clean, or do you want it to be, you know, is that a sort of like, is it like, do one follow one side versus the other, or is it a question of managing client expectations and then some other sort of formal obsession and on one side, and so I wonder whether or not, and I mean, for Isaac, I found the way that you talked about the messiness was so, there's a sort of aesthetic in a way, in terms of the way that the sort of super haptic materials, super tactile materials that you're using, but also the sort of way of working, right? Like you are like sewing, and you're like planting, and you're like spackling, and there's this kind of like everything is happening almost all at once in the way that you presented it. Seems almost like there's a sort of live wildness also in your method of working, and like being open to like all of the things that are taking place. So I wonder where, like, is this aesthetic? Is this conceptual? Is this a practice? Is this information? Where is this vocabulary, and where is this sort of instinct in for all of you guys?
I mean, I guess for me, it's interesting, this tension of not just having everything messy and like anything could go because it's chaotic and can be okay. For me, it's this tension between this very controlled aesthetic or obsessions, and then leave some room for this accident that can be actually designed, or can be actually as part of the construction process, as the stucco lines, or as the vegetation, and part of that is aesthetic interest, as the reference I show in the paintings. Also, part of that, I think it's understanding the culture where I'm working, that we don't have Swiss super crafted details, and if you want to do that, like you could be you could spend 5 times the budget and you will never get that. So it's part of understanding that and working with that. And yeah, I mean, I find that very interesting. I don't know about Formless.
Yeah, the non-Swiss.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, Julian and I have talked about being a kind of weird Swiss firm, on and off, just like, anyway, I think for us, the client thing is interesting, because there is this, we want to build, like our project started as an academic project through our thesis, through drawings and kind of imagining what a formless architecture would be. But I think pretty instantly we wanted to try to prove that we could do it. We wanted to build. And what we found very early was that if you wanted, on one hand, no precision, you needed very high precision to balance it. And we kind of tell this story, but when we proposed the tent pile project at the Department of Building in Miami, they said, like, what if the pile falls over? And we spent like a long time explaining the physics that like a pile has already fallen over. There's no way for it to fall over again. It's like already fallen. So, but like, so people feel comfortable if you like putting that slice through it, having a clean and a dirty side, they feel more comfortable that there's a level of control alongside the messiness. And we actually think like if everything's out of control, you kind of don't notice. Like the way if everything's super precise, it kind of all goes mute. You may not even recognize that precision. So for us having heavy and light or messy and unmessy, that kind of dialectic always heightens the messiness, and then it's controlling that so that people can use the messiness or view it in a certain way. I'm sure Julian wants to jump in on this too. So.
Yeah, I'd just add quickly. I mean, I think Garrett's right that it's a dialectic, and Isaac, that's kind of what I hear you talking about too. That you know, ultimately it won't read if it's all messy, and just if we're trying to make these critical gestures in part, I mean, there needs to be something for the formless side to be critiquing, kind of present in the project, I think, for it to just hang together conceptually. But I think I would add two things. One is that for us, it's also about not letting go of use value. And we really do see this as a kind of utilitarian project in a way. And so you have to balance that. Like another anecdote about 10 pile, we did a series of quick studies of piling different materials. And of course, sand in the end made a lot of sense because it was local, but we sort of, as a conceptual exercise, did everything from mud to a rock. And basically like, you know, a pile of mud doesn't exist. It's just a puddle and you can't hold up a roof, and you could have a single rock holding up a roof, but then it's basically just a column. So it's sort of finding that sweet spot for us, I think, in part. And then I think on a very simple level, the messiness just boils down to an attitude about inviting participation also, because I think we found with projects, you know, especially public projects, if people don't feel like they can mess it up, they're a lot more willing to kind of, you know, poke around and play with it in maybe unexpected ways. So I think we're very invested in not over prescribing the use of our projects. And sometimes that does require conversations with the client, and, you know, it requires asking everybody for a little more flexibility. But I think that's part of it too, is that if something feels unfixed, then any user is going to feel free to kind of interact with it in different ways.
I love that. I think that the point of the sort of non-normative behavior that may be a sort of B-side of working in with things that are a little bit surprising or unusual or counter to what you would imagine. I mean, I wonder Isaac, the work that you guys are working on right now, how do you see the subject of your architecture? Does that play into the way, like the way in which somebody is going to kind of maybe want to touch certain things? Or I'm wondering how the haptic, right, the idea of the tactile plays into or could play into a sort of emerging kind of conversation around how you situate the sort of user and subject. I'm wondering whether or not that's something that you guys are sort of talking about at all.
I mean, definitely but in the scale that we're working in, most of the interior projects or the landscape, there's like a sense of how the user will engage into these small details, whether they perceive it or not at once, but the way that you can be discovering when you look closer new things. And I mean, I don't know if the user does discover them or not, but we try to work with those.
I'm gonna shout out to all the people who are watching, attendees too. We're gonna open up to a Q&A in a little bit. We'll probably talk for another, so please feel free to throw any questions you have in the chat. And I'll start to get to them, but feel free to do that. And I'll be attempting to look at the same time. So there's like the crisis of the drawing, right? The crisis of the drawing, which seems to be also quite shared. And I think that one of my, Garrett and Julian, I very much enjoyed the video. Isaac, and your movie that you put in the exhibition, and in some ways the very ending was a sort of reflection of how the hell are we going to draw a plan about this, right? And the sort of your sort of pivoting towards a new forms of visualization for the kind of layers of the project. And I was equally was sort of charmed by Isaac when you guys were talking about the bending of the plates, and like you're like, so we drew the hell out of it. So we did all this stuff, but then they couldn't build it this way. So then we did this, and we drew all the circles, and then we thought we could do it like this, but then it didn't work. So then we drew it like this, and they just put the thing down, and then and they just did it on site at full scale, and they bent it, and it was amazing. And I was like, this is it's like there's this kind of incredible like optimism that the drawing is somehow going to do something, and in the end you're like telling, you're drawing these beautiful diagrams, and then you're asking the individuals who are applying the stucco just kind of do it like this, like kind of like this, like the way in which the drawing versus the instruction, the sort of formalism of the drawing and the sort of intentionality and control, and the sort of rigor, the sort of sight of architectural thought, which happens at the drawing and measurement and geometry, is somehow insufficient in certain moments of the work. And so I don't know, I wonder whether or not all things are still, like when you talk about your work and show the work, you still want to show the drawings, because somehow the drawings, like for instance, Isaac's, those drawings are so beautiful. Like it's like miralles, it's like so like careful and the sort of you can almost sense the sort of piping and the bending by the way that it's kind of calibrated to that tolerance. So I wonder what happens to the drawing, what happens to instruction in your work. And of course, for Julian and for Garrett, the kind of the drawing seems to be gone, or there as a sort of relic, as a sort of past, but nonetheless, like wholly insufficient to be able to take on like the kind of cultural layering that you're looking for. So how can we talk about? Do we want to talk about drawing? Like, what do we want to talk about when it comes to representation?
I mean, I remember the first lecture Julian and I gave. One of the first questions that came out of the audience was like, "Why are you guys even drawing anymore?" Because we were making videos from. The film is kind of full circle back to some of our first projects that were made as videos, like pouring piles to figure out structure, and we were calling them drawings, and then people were saying like, "Why are you calling these drawings?" Like it was just kind of an attempt to architecturalize, even though maybe we had found a new way of working that was undrawable. And so I think the Kuwait project's in a little bit of a different area, just because it's not about a type of architecture that's necessarily undrawable, but it's about a scenario and layer of stories that's undrawable, like the archaeological story, the modernization of Kuwait's story. It's like too many layers it would just be like historical notes or narrative notes on a drawing sheet, which maybe that's something we should do. But so it's a way to bring all the narratives into the telling of the project and kind of call it a drawing. There's the narrative side. And then I guess I would just say we do a lot of drawings, but they tend to be like, we have a ton of shop drawings are really important to our practice. And like that truss in Miami is like drawn to death. Like it's so overdrawn, like to the 32nd of an inch drawn. And the Art Forum bookstore has like really comprehensive shop drawings for someone to be able to make it. But then the stool that Julian talked about briefly, literally it was like, okay, you have a drill bit that's 24 inches wide, like, okay, drill that, like piece of bridge that, was just laying on, so it required zero drawing to make that piece of furniture. So we kind of, again, it's almost like the dialectic. We have like overdrawn scenarios and non-drawing scenarios. That's a kind of constant that pops up, right? I mean, Julian, I don't know if you want, but we're always back and forth between too many or zero drawings.
You wanna, Julian, go.
Isaac, go ahead.
I mean, for us, I guess it's something similar. Like the drawings sometimes are a way to try to figure out how to build these ideas. And why I showed this in the vended steel was because we were trying to explore how to build these geometries, and of course we also love like this disciplinary culture of drawing that you mentioned, reference of Miralles and all of this. But at the end, for this specific budget and project, it didn't work because like the only way it could work for the budget, it was just to unfold and work it in the site. I think the part where we leave open more of the times is more like this messy aspect where we still haven't figured out how to draw it, and have found that it's sometimes even maybe better or easier, and the result is actually more organic or messy if you don't plan it. Like if we would have planned every line in the stucco, I think it would have looked over designed, and we always try to be very careful in create this sense of relax, not over design. But it's actually, I think it's maybe a more obsessive idea of trying to control this uncontrolled part. I don't know if it makes sense.
Simon, I think that makes perfect sense, Isaac. And I think something that we can really relate to is that on the one hand, drawing is an important mode of communication still, you know, and that there are things that you kind of have to draw to get built, and then there are things you can't draw. And I think one lesson we've tried to really learn in our practice is that just to remember that drawing is only one tool. I think we're kind of at a moment where architects sort of think of drawing as their ultimate expression of disciplinarity somehow still. And I think Garrett and I talked about this. I mean, there's almost a sort of ironic way in which the rise of digital technology has made the line drawing like even more fetishized as a kind of disciplinary practice. And that's something we definitely would reject. But, you know, and I think remembering that it's a tool among others helps you understand that sometimes it can really get you into trouble. Like getting obsessed with drawing something that really can't be drawn can send you down a rabbit hole, whereas you maybe can just have a conversation with the contractor, as I think some of Isaac's work really elegantly showed. But I think we're also, you know, and I think it seems like we really share this with Isaac as well. I think we're invested in the idea of architects doing things in the world. And I think that's also, you know, this interest in materiality, I think in some ways is opposed to the drawing. And I think, you know, Garrett and I, you know, we were educated at Princeton. We're from New York. He's a LA transplant. I guess I can let out that secret. But, you know, there's really a drawing culture here. And there's a sense that, like, you know, sort of the last great avant-garde in architecture was like, you know, really like the New York Five, and was very drawing focused. And I think there's a kind of abstraction to that, and an ungroundedness, and honestly a kind of insularity that we're trying to reject. And so part of that is engaging materials however you can. And when drawings can help, fantastic. And sometimes they're absolutely necessary, as Garrett's saying, but also that means not seeing drawing as the ultimate product of architecture.
I mean, I guess we share this notion of that you sometimes cannot draw, of looking at the material and trying to find like a new, not new, but like an expression, a hidden expression that you can discover. And then maybe you need to sometimes go back to draw that, or maybe you don't, like you just push that without drawing it.
I want to ask a question that's kind of not really fully formed in my mind, but it has to do with, Isaac, there was a project that's in your portfolio, and that is, I think, in the well, maybe it's not an exhibition, but it's in your portfolio. Well, it was something that I was really struck by when we were looking sort of at the beginning of like looking at all these portfolios everywhere. But it was the project of the sort of, it's a pavilion, an inverted pavilion of the dome, and just the bricks. And there's the sort of stack of bricks and a sort of negative imprint of a dome and a sort of view of the dome beyond. And I'm reading it in the way that I read it. I don't know how you guys conceived of it. I mean, there was a sort of very simple, of all the family of forms, let's say, that you showed in your lecture, it's the one that's the most simple. It's like the one that's like the dumbest, right? It's just like a thing and a thing, you know. And it's also so it also has such an elegance in the way that it's kind of refers to itself and refers to something else outside of it, right? It's sort of, at least the way I'm seeing it, is in relationship to sort of the inversion of the dome, and also highly relaxed, like you said, like kind of like not over designing anything in some ways. It's like, it's kind of as a fact, like this kind of stack of material, a stack of things in a circle, and I wonder whether or not that is that sort of that sort of reduction, and sort of ease of a project like that is something that is, I don't know whether or not you see that project in that way as compared to some of the work which is sort of really working on kind of surface geometry, like very carefully. We're like rigorously working through surface geometry, and so I wonder whether or not that project is a sort of unicorn, sort of different than everything else, or do you see it all sort of really as the sort of kind of even constellation, or if it's a product of like working in collaboration with many voices. I'm just curious about that, which stood out so much to me in your portfolio.
Thank you. I mean, on this one, it's this one. I think there are, for me, many ways on seeing it. The first one, it's a collaboration with 3 different firms of friends. So we got together, and each one of us had a different interest, and actually each one has a different story about the conceptual story about the project. And I'm comfortable with that. Like, I think architecture should be with multiple readings, not one clear solution. To me, the interest in this one and the way I relate it, I see how it's separated to the rest because it's simpler and more bold. The way I kind of relate it is in the sense that it's this like dichotomy of this rigid box, and then once you enter, you get this like organic inverted bolt, and also in the section where it's cut, the entrance, like you see these two frames basically of bricks. My interest lies in this project particularly in material, in the way you have this smooth inverted bolt, and then how that is pixelated into the brick and actually processed into the everyday, and in the like Cartesian versus organic. That's how I related with the others, but I also see how it doesn't. And I mean, it's also exciting to see it as a separate entity.
Mm-hmm. But, I'm maybe a little unrelated, and I'm gonna ask one of the questions off the chat in just a second to Garrett and Julian, which has to do with but maybe in a similar tone, which is the sort of references to infrastructure and landscape in your work, and as well as like unit type that's sort of like typical unit types, like like the was it the frame system you used for tent pile, right? This sort of referring to things that are sort of existing and known, but really specifically like infrastructure and landscape as things which are highly extensive, maybe not object oriented, things that are maybe can fall into the background in a formal way, and how that I don't know, because there's a sort of like, there's a high levels of iconicity. Like there's this kind of idea about like that the tent pile is just a super iconic project. At the same time, it's also flirting with things that are that want to recede in a way into the background. And so I'm wondering what kind of conversations you guys are having about the sort of kind of foreground background of like the aesthetic project of your work.
Yeah, that's a really, we haven't put it in those terms, but those are terms we're going to take back to the studio with us, because I think it's a really interesting way for us to think about it. I think our vocabulary is more focused around, let's say, the found and the mute, which has been written about and discussed both in kind of art practice and architectural practice. And yeah, so I would just sort of throw that out there, the found and the mute kind of being the starting point. And I think it's interesting because like very often let's say our precedents, if we're looking at icons or precedents to start from, they tend to be more structural than architectural. Like, we're never starting from the glass house, but we might start from a bridge or or something found in the landscape. And yeah, obviously we're probably, you can tell, incredibly interested in land art practice, which has taken the mute or the backdrop or the background as kind of landscape, anonymous, and rethought the components and the figures of the landscape to produce. I don't think we're really interested in making that iconic, like land artists turn those features into things iconic. I think we're probably too much interested in like use value, like how to actually use it as a structure. So yeah, iconicity is not something we talk about in our work, but I think when you deal with super simple elements, it ends up becoming a cylinder, a square, a triangle. Like they have these kind of maybe not iconic, but monolithic presence, which leans towards iconicity, I guess. So.
I would just add, I think, first of all, echoing Garrett's thanks, I think those are really provocative terms to think about this in, and we'll definitely digest that a little more, the sort of background, foreground. But I think part of it for us too is about the direction of scale. And I think we find something very productive about moving down in scale, kind of in the reverse from infrastructure to architecture. Yeah. Whereas I think we feel like it's maybe more common to move up in scale, like from a sculpture to a building, and part of that is purely practical. I mean, we sort of joked about this since like one of the first projects we did was an unsuccessful PS1 proposal, but one of our favorite parts was we were proposing to use a geotextile, which is basically invented for things like highway embankments and erosion control. And it was sold by the acre. Like we were trying to purchase so many square feet for the project, and you couldn't even buy a square foot. So I think we find something, I mean, honestly, some of the most ambitious interventions into the built environment are infrastructural. It's just a whole different scale. And if you can take something that works, at a level of a few miles and use it for your building, I mean, they're just going to be kind of some radical savings and radical inversions that happen. But I think it's also a little bit for us about the limitations of authorship, or just trying to kind of get comfortable with other modes of authorship. I mean, I think we're just resisting this idea that architects should be designing unique objects, I mean, that's just something we're not as interested in. I think that part of looking at this expanded scale is just trying to rethink what it means for us to design something.
Yeah, Julian, just to piggyback one little thing on that, like the Kuwait Project, something we're really fascinated by. It is a kind of museum. It's an institutional building, which typically gets billed at $500, $600, $700, $800 a square foot. You build a highway at $9 a square foot, right? And I think for us that's really interesting both being where we are in our career, meaning we don't build buildings at $800 a square foot at all. No way. So, but the thought that we could build a museum for $15 a square foot, that's kind of compelling. I don't know who we don't know who to necessarily bring that to, but it's an idea about value that I think we take very seriously. So
I think we can all get behind that. I think that's a great way to end. For the individual who did share some questions, I'm sorry, we're going to have to sort of sign off. I mean, I think that we would all like to now be all together and hang out and have a beer, but in lieu of that, I want to thank you guys. It was great.
And diving in, hi, we all would like a cool beer, especially here where we're sweating away in New York. I'm Ann Rieselbach, the League's program director, and on behalf of the League, I'd like to thank the League Prize Committee, Mira, who you heard this evening, along with Kutan Ayada and Kevin Hirth, who developed this year's competition theme and chose the additional members of the jury, Lucia Ale, Paul Lewis, Anna Punyaner, and Nanaka Umamoto. They all worked together to select this year's winners, and once again, the winners themselves for their ability to shift so ably and creatively for their plans for a gallery-based exhibit, which they had actually begun to develop before the world changed, and switching to an online-only format. And I hope you've had the opportunity to view their online exhibit. It's on the League's website, and along with interviews, biographical information, and also these lectures, all 3 weeks of lectures will be up within the next week or two on the website alongside those. A huge thanks to the League staff members, in particular, Katarina Flaxman, who along with Sarah Wessler, Ann Carlisle, Nanasi Shirakawa, and Dan Chofi skillfully worked with the winners to help them develop, edit, and share their work in different ways. Thanks also to Britt Cobb and Michael Beirut of Pentagram, who once again designed the competition graphics. Michael's been doing this since the inception of this program in 1981. And the team at the School of the Constructed Environments and the Sheila C. Johnson Design Center at Parsons. They've hosted the lectures and exhibit for the past decade, and hopefully will again next year, but really gave us valuable advice as we were trying to think through what the online exhibit should be and how it should work. The entire League Prize program is made possible by the enthusiastic ongoing support from Hunter Douglas Architectural, Kubani Judlow, and Tischler and Son, and support is also provided by the Next Generation Fund, which is an alumni fund of the Architectural League's Emerging Voices and League Prize programs, as well as the J. Clausen Mills Fund of the Architectural League. League programs are also made possible in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in a partnership with the City Council and the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of Andrew M. Cuomo and the New York State Legislature. Really importantly, all online and live programs are supported by the League's members. Please consider joining. You can check the League's website for membership information. You can join. You can sign up for our weekly newsletter, whether you join or not, to learn more about upcoming programs, publications, and new initiatives such as Shifting Ground, which we just announced last week. It's an open call for visual reports that capture the relationship between society and the built environment during this unprecedented time. We will be running those on our Instagram feed and also post some on our website. We have 3 programs scheduled for the coming week, 2 centered on COVID-19 and inclusive public space, a current work lecture by Joel Sanders and Seb Coe of mixed design, followed the next day by a panel discussion moderated by Mark Suromaki with Joel again and other mixed design team members. Thursday evening, the League is co-sponsoring a conversation organized by the New York Review of Architecture, moderated by Sanjeev Vaidya, on anti-racism and inclusion in architecture schools, with students and alumni from a broad range of architecture programs who compare their experiences, talk about next steps, and field questions from the public. So please hang out with us in the coming weeks. And thank you again for joining us tonight.